Can you imagine these words? Those were the last words my father said to me before he shoved me into an October blizzard and locked the door behind me. Get out of my house. I don't need a sick daughter. I was 15 years old. I had no coat, no phone, no money, just a school backpack with algebra homework inside and rain turning into ice, already soaking through my sneakers. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who is part of our community. 13 years later, the rain in Boston looks different. From the 30th floor of my office, it doesn't feel like a threat anymore. It's just background noise to the steady hum of my server. I'm Rachel, and in this city, I'm a name people respect. My life is a series of precise calculations. I don't deal in maybe or if. I deal in done. My phone vibrated on the mahogany desk. A digital notification flashed, an email from a state-run nursing facility outside the city. The subject line was my father's name, Stephen. I stared at it for exactly 5 seconds. The message was a desperate plea. He was in the final stages of a respiratory collapse. He was dying. He wanted a visit. He wanted to say he was sorry. I didn't feel my heart race. I didn't feel a lump in my throat. I felt the same cold clarity I use when I'm auditing a failing department. I'd been the silent investor in their version of family for 15 years, footing the emotional bill while receiving zero dividends. My father was finally reaching out, but only because his own accounts were empty. His health was bankrupt, and he was looking for a bailout. I thought about his shaky handwriting. I thought about the words, "I'm sorry." In the world of accounting, an apology without restitution is just a bad debt. It doesn't balance the books. 13 years of silence is a long time for interest to accrue. I moved my cursor over the notification and clicked Archive. No reply. No visit. Just another closed file. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. Below me, the harbor was gray and restless. I took a sip of my coffee, black and bitter. On the wall behind me sat a framed document. It wasn't a degree or an award. It was a copy of the legal freeze I had placed on Seawood Estate 6 months ago. My family thought they could live off the remains of my mother's legacy while they ignored my existence. They didn't realize I had spent the last decade buying up their debt and securing the titles to their comfort. Stephen wasn't just losing his life. He was losing the roof over his head. I wasn't being cruel. I was just collecting the interest on the night he threw me into the storm. Seawood Estate was never a home. It was a kingdom, and I was the peasant allowed to live in the servants' quarters as long as I kept the floors polished. While Victoria spent her afternoons at the country club, draped in our mother's silk scarves, I was in the master bedroom, changing medication bags and documenting treatment schedules. I wasn't just a daughter. I was an unpaid hospice nurse for the woman Stephen and Victoria had already decided was a lost asset. My mother had a locket. It was gold, engraved with a small sea holly, and it held the only photo of us before the cancer turned her into a shadow. She promised it to me on her last night. She said it was my emergency fund, something to remind me that I was loved when the rest of the house went cold. 2 days after she passed, the locket vanished. Victoria told my father I'd probably sold it to fund my unstable hobbies. Stephen didn't even check the jewelry box. He just took her word for it, adding another line to my ledger of perceived failures. I kept my head down. I kept the house running. Most people look at a girl like that and see weakness. They see a victim who is too afraid to scream. But they don't understand the psychological weight of the invisible chain. Growing up in a house like Seawood is like living in a prison without bars. Some call it learned helplessness, but for me, it was a tactical survival mechanism. I wasn't resigned because I was broken. I was resigned because I was a survivor. Every time Victoria mocked my status, or Stephen ignored my existence, I wasn't weeping. I was observing. I was learning the guard schedule. I was mapping the exits. I knew that in this house, my compassion was a luxury they had been overdrafting for years. I let them believe I was just a phase they could ignore while I quietly secured the evidence of their rot. The clarity came 3 months before the storm. I was cleaning Victoria's room while she was out celebrating her 19th birthday. In the back of her designer vanity, hidden behind a stack of credit card statements, I found a slip of paper. It was a receipt from a high-end pawn shop downtown. The item listed was one gold-engraved locket. The payout was $3,500. My sister hadn't just stolen a memory, she had liquidated it to pay for a weekend in the city. At that moment, I realized my role in this family was strictly transactional. I was the one who provided the labor, so they could enjoy the profit. I didn't confront her. I didn't tell Stephen. I knew he would just find a way to make it my fault. Instead, I took a photo of the receipt and put it back. That was the first entry in my professional ledger. I wasn't a daughter anymore. I was a debt collector, and I was going to wait until the interest was high enough to bankrupt them both. The air inside the foyer was heavy with the smell of wet wool and wood smoke. Stephen was standing under the chandelier, his shadow stretching across the marble floor like a jagged stain. He wasn't just angry, he was vibrating. Beside him, Victoria stood with her arms wrapped around herself, the perfect picture of a heartbroken sister who had just discovered a dark secret. She held a leather-bound notebook, my mother's old diary that I used for sketches. Or what I thought was my sketchpad. She had spent the whole day preparing the stage, feeding Stephen lies like poison wrapped in sugar. She'd planted $3,500 into my algebra book, the exact amount I'd seen on her pawn receipt. Only now the narrative had changed. It wasn't her theft, it was mine. Explain this, Stephen barked. His voice was like a physical blow. He threw my backpack at my feet. The algebra homework I'd worked on for hours spilled across the tiles, but he didn't care about my grades. He cared about the thick wad of bills tucked into the binding of my textbook. And he cared about the diary. Victoria had forged entries in the back pages. Detailed, shaky notes about clearing the debt by burning the secondary accounts or setting fire to the estate for the insurance money. It was a masterpiece of malice. I looked at the handwriting. It was a crude imitation of mine, but Stephen didn't look close enough to see the mismatch. He only looked at the betrayal he'd already decided was real. Patricia, my stepmother, hovered in the doorway, a silent accomplice to the execution. This was the trap of normalized cruelty. Stephen didn't believe Victoria because her story was airtight. He believed her because it was the most convenient path for his own fractured ego. In a house like Seawood, cruelty is eventually rebranded as discipline. It is easier for a negligent parent to cast one child as the villain than to admit their golden child is a criminal. By victimizing me, Stephen didn't have to face the truth about his own failures or the wife he couldn't save. Blaming the sick daughter allowed him to keep his comfortable lie while he liquidated the last of my mother's legacy. I don't need a sick daughter, he said, his face the color of raw meat. He grabbed my shoulder and shoved me toward the massive mahogany doors. The storm was screaming outside, the temperature dropping 15 degrees in an hour. I had no coat, no phone, no money, just my soaking sneakers and a backpack full of textbooks that meant nothing now. The deadbolt clicked. It was the sound of a final transaction. He wasn't just locking a door, he was closing an emotional account he thought had no value left. Everything stayed silent for days after I archived Stephen's message. But in my head, the numbers were finally beginning to line up. I wasn't just Rachel, the girl who survived. I was Rachel, the lead auditor of a 13-year-old crime. I didn't waste time on regret. I didn't wonder what might have happened if I had just stayed and begged. I spent my energy on the spreadsheets, on the paper trail that had been waiting for me to find it. I met Kimberly at a quiet diner near the industrial docks. The air smelled of salt and stale coffee, a scent that always reminded me of the night she pulled me from the side of the road. Back then, she was a social worker with a badge and a soft voice. Now, she was a private investigator with a sharp mind and a hard edge. We didn't talk about the weather. We exchanged files. I've traced the secondary accounts, Kimberly said, sliding a manila folder across the table. Her voice was clinical. It wasn't just the locket, Rachel. Your mother had 4 secondary accounts that Stephen didn't even know existed. I opened the folder. The paper smelled like dusty basements and old secrets. I ran my fingers over the photocopied checks. Victoria's handwriting was always looped and arrogant, even when she was trying to hide it. She'd labeled these transactions as estate maintenance and administrative fees. It was a clinical execution of my mother's legacy. Look at the dates, Kimberly pointed out. Every time you were at a low point, when you were sleeping on a friend's couch, Victoria was buying a new car or a designer wardrobe with this money. The total was $45,000. Exactly. It wasn't a random amount. It was the exact value of the trust fund my mother had set up for me. Victoria hadn't just stolen money. She had mirrored the value of my future and turned it into her own personal slush fund. She had overdrafted my compassion for years, and now I was seeing the final balance sheet. We have enough for a legal freeze on all Seawood property taxes, I told Kimberly. If Victoria wants to keep playing the role of the estate's heir, she can explain these withdrawals to the state comptroller. I stood up and left the diner. I didn't look back at the past. I looked forward to the audit. In my world, facts are lethal. Inside, my laptop glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet retribution. We weren't looking for closure anymore. We were looking for the kill shot. Now, we were digging into the psychological foundations of the crime Victoria committed 13 years ago. Kimberly slid a faded blue folder across the desk. It wasn't a financial statement. It was a medical file from a private psychiatric consultant named Dr. Eris. Victoria didn't just want you out of the house, Rachel, Kimberly said, her voice as level and cold as a winter morning. She wanted you erased from the legal record entirely. I opened the file. The document inside was a psychological assessment dated exactly 2 days before the night of the storm. It was a masterpiece of professional perjury. The report labeled me as mentally unstable, possessing a predisposition for violent outbursts, and being a direct threat to the safety of the estate assets. It was a clinical execution. Victoria had been playing a much longer game than I realized. She hadn't just been stealing locket money. She was positioning herself to trigger the guardianship clause in our mother's trust. I stared at the numbers mentioned in the trust overview. $110,000. That was the price Victoria had put on my sanity. If I were institutionalized before I turned 21, she would be my court-appointed guardian, with full, legal access to every cent our mother had saved for me. Check the payment logs, Kimberly instructed. I scrolled through the digital spreadsheets. There it was, a transfer of $20,000 made to an offshore account linked to Dr. Eris. It was labeled as a consultation fee, but in my world, we call that a bribe. Victoria had used $20,000 of the money she had already embezzled to buy a professional lie. But the lethal discovery, the actual kill shot, was on the final page of the committal application. I stared at the line where the parent's consent was required. Stephen Walls was written in dark, shaky ink. I didn't need a forensic auditor to see the mismatch. The loops were too tight. Victoria had forged our father's signature while he was passed out at the bottom of a bourbon bottle. She hadn't just betrayed her sister, she had rendered her father a legal ghost in his own foyer. I felt a satisfying hum of precision deep in my chest. Victoria thought she was a master strategist, but she had treated my sanity like an asset to be liquidated, and now she was about to face the final audit. I looked at Kimberly and gave a single, cold nod. Call the district attorney, I said. It's time to call in the debt. Stephen and Victoria entered my office like two ghosts haunting a building they could no longer afford. Victoria looked gray, her designer bag clutched like a shield against the professional silence of my floor. Stephen was in a wheelchair, his breathing a mechanical stutter that filled the room. They didn't look like the rulers of a kingdom anymore. They looked like the casualties of their own bad management. Victoria didn't lead with an apology. She led with a demand wrapped in a desperate plea. Rachel, look at him, she whispered. He's dying. We can't pay for the care he needs because of your legal freeze. Just lift it for a week so we can sell the estate and pay these medical bills. Please, we're family. I didn't feel my heart race. I felt the satisfying click of a ledger finally balancing. I looked at the sister who had pawned my mother's locket and the father who had believed the lie because it was convenient. Family is a contract, Victoria, I said, my voice as cold as the storm they had thrown me into. You breached that contract the second you forged Stephen's signature to have me institutionalized so you could seize my $110,000 trust fund. Her face went from pale to ghostly. Stephen's eyes flickered with a sudden, sharp confusion that was 13 years too late. I didn't do it for the money, she choked out. Then you did it for free, which makes you even more bankrupt than I thought. I didn't slide a check across the mahogany desk. I slid a blue folder. Inside was a copy of the bribery evidence and a warrant for her arrest for misappropriation of funds and forgery. You told me you didn't need a sick daughter, I said, looking at Stephen for the final time. Well, I don't need a dying legacy built on theft. Goodbye, Victoria. The snow was starting to melt at Seawood Estate when I stood on the porch a week later. The house wasn't a kingdom anymore. It was a foundation for displaced youth, a safe haven for kids who had been written out of their own stories. I took the gold holly-engraved locket out of my pocket, and I finally fastened it around my neck. I felt the weight of it against my chest, a reminder that my identity was never their asset to liquidate. To those of you listening who have always felt like the invisible one, the one sitting at the spares table while the golden children feast, this is for you. You're not a phase. You are not a burden to be managed. Your worth isn't a line item in someone else's budget. Sometimes the only way to find a home is to let the one they built for you burn down and build something stronger from the ashes. You don't need their permission to be luminous. If this story resonated with you, hit the share button. Let's remind everyone that your worth isn't determined by those who couldn't see it. Subscribe for more stories of justice and resilience.